I think ultimately a lot of gamers are really just interested in those raw specifications, especially gamers who are coming from like RTX 3000 or 4000, maybe looking for an upgrade and looking through those bandwidth figures, looking at the memory bus, looking at the number of cores, SMs, etc., trying to come to some conclusion regarding relative performance here. So what's going on? I think we should probably start with those two highest end cards, the 5090 and the 5080. What should we make of those two cards? And what should we make of the pretty big specs gulf that I think separates them? What should we make of all those factors there, Alex?
Yeah, so the spec differentials between RTX 5090, which is a Halo product, versus the RTX 5080, which is the current highest end product below it, are actually some of the largest we've ever seen in any of the NVIDIA generations before this. RTX 3090, for example, and RTX 3080 had a gulf, but it was, reserved mainly to being most noticeable on the highest end RT titles, or technically those titles that had a lot of VRAM usage, which at the time of launch wasn't many, actually. Scroll ahead to now. We've got the RTX 5080 on the spec sheet saying 56 shader T-flops and 105 for the RTX 5090. So on a theoretical level, at least, it is almost twice as powerful. That is a big deal, actually. I think we're going to see some very large differences in a number of titles, I think, specifically, especially those ones leveraging ray tracing. But vis-a-vis the last gen, that's a question we'll get to at the end of this video, like how good is it for the price? And we're going to have to wait for reviews for those sort of things, but you can already start talking about it now based upon other factors. Another thing to point out is that the RTX 5080, has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, much like the 40 series before it, while the RTX 5090, with its increased memory bus size, 512-bit versus 256-bit of the RTX 5080, well, it's now racking 32 gigs of VRAM. Not very useful for modern games. This is more the RTX 5090 is seen as a super high-end Halo product for creators, for people running like local machine learning, or for people editing 4K video or 8K video. That is really useful. But even if you tap out games to like 4K DLAA with all the stuff maxed out, you're not going to be seeing 24 gigs usually filled in any game. And that's already talking about games that are using full ray tracing with high quality textures and all that. So I think this is more just a future-proofing creator thing, but it is a pretty big divide here between RTX 5080 and 5090. And as we get to the end of this video, we'll see that, that may be a pretty big deal. Another part of this is that the price, the theoretical performance on paper is half for the 5080. The price is also halved. It's $999 MSRP there for the new Founders Edition version, and it's $1999 US dollars, $1,999 US dollars for the RTX 5090. So it is a price bump versus the RTX 4090.
So yeah, Alex, I mean, I personally find the 5090 to be a very interesting GPU because I think it's clear to me that Nvidia is kind of looking at that top end of the market and maybe just pulling it up a little bit because they know they're at the top. They don't have any other competition except themselves. And I feel like they're kind of pushing that up a little bit, pushing the price up a little bit to match. But I actually do think if you look at these bar charts here, I did some quick pixel counting, albeit not
Genius.
Pixel counting of the usual type, pixel counting the bar charts. And they're basically saying that in non-multi-frame gen workloads, you can probably expect about a 30% performance increase relative to the 4090 in titles like Resident Evil 4 and titles like Horizon Forbidden West. So it is pretty gigantic, and the cooling requirements are more substantial, but that is a pretty decent increase. That's kind of comparable, I think, to what you would have seen with a lot of 20 series cards relative to the 10 series. Maybe
Yes.
not the biggest generational uplift in NVIDIA's history, but also not a small uplift, certainly. For the 5080, it's a smaller improvement. It's more like 15%. Again, before MFG is factored in, which we can discuss later. And also that's not factoring in games that might use like extensive neural rendering of different types and things like this that might actually push that out further, you might imagine.
Yeah.
These are older existing titles. So in general, I think it's definitely a case where, on the lower end, what you're looking at is you're looking at pretty much price parity with the outgoing GPU products, or similar prices to the outgoing GPU products there. But you're getting a decent uplift in performance, not huge, but decent. And then the MFG. And on the high end, you kind of just get to play with a die that's getting closer to that reticle limit, and it's giving you more of that real high end power there for a higher price, but not really a hugely higher price, I think. That being said, Nvidia has a very interesting cooling solution that actually enables both of these cards, at least their Founders Edition variants, to be pretty slim and sleek 2-slot designs. So could you explain Nvidia's new flow-through cooling design and methodology here, Alex? Because it is very novel with these higher-end 50 series cards.
Actually, yeah, this is one of the coolest aspects, and was pretty surprising when they did show it off, is the fact that it is a two slot for the RTX 5090 and RTX 5080, RTX 4000 specifically, RTX 4080, 4080 Super, etc., and RTX 4090 all share the same really large cooler, 3-slot, thick, a lot like the RTX 3090 before, unlike the RTX 3080, which was very thin for the FE version. And now we have them turning to this design which allows airflow to go through in a straight manner through the entire card. And they have moved from like this reverse kind of fan on one side, fan on the other side at opposite ends of the GPU, to have them being on both one side of the GPU and slimming it down. The heatsink is itself a lot smaller as a result. And the reason why they're able to do this is probably because of the new PCB being smaller. It's no longer like that kind of like arrowed V shape that it was previously, but it's actually 3 separate PCBs, one for PCIe, one for IO display, and then the other one is actually like the GPU and memory surrounding it. And it's a lot smaller as a result of that. And it allows for this new super competitive design. And it actually does make me wonder what the whole point of an AIB card is anymore, the board partner cards, because this thing looks ridiculously competitive. It is sleek, it is suave, and it's going to maybe be MSRP wise one of the lower ones, depending upon what ends up happening. It's Nvidia has all this money and research to leverage into such a design, but it is like, it's making me call into question what's the point for something like this. When we get to the 5070, we'll talk about something different there. Yeah. But it's this one, it's pretty awesome looking, and I'm happy in terms of for making a case and whatnot. Like, you don't have to get the super long, super wide, worrying about whether or not a PCIe lane or a PCI 1X lane is going to be covered. This will just be like kind of like an older GPU before things started getting really ridiculous.
Yeah. I certainly am very sympathetic to that perspective, because I think this design is very clever in a lot of respects. It's a great way to cut down on the size of the needed heatsink and get more efficient cooling performance. Like you said, by getting air to just flow straight through the card instead of needing to flow through and then be dispersed out slots on the side, or be blown through the back of the card, or like all these different arrangements that involve the air changing direction. Now you're just getting that full flow through design, whereas in previous generations, like, the Founders Editions would have one that flowed through. Now it's both flowing through, and I think that's quite compelling. The only thing is that it requires a very, very tiny PCB to work. I don't know if the partner PCBs are the same as NVIDIA's PCBs in this respect for every card. That's going to be certainly a question.
Yeah, that's another thing to know. And just if anyone wants to get a little bit like up close and personal look of that, there's actually a great video from PC World. Adam Patrick Murray, who you and I both met there, made a video about it, talking with an NVIDIA rep. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, but I would completely echo Alex's comments here also with regards to the partner cards, and we should have some footage going on screen here, but I got right up and close and personal, and so did Alex, with these partner cards, and they look monstrous in comparison. They're like 3.5, 4 slots. They just look huge relative to the 5090, 5080 Founders Editions, which look really nice and really slim. Some of the higher end 5090s have liquid coolers, which is a bit of an exception though. And I did note that the MSI Special Edition 5090s actually also appear to use that dual flow through design. So at least those must have this miniaturized PCB design there. But they do look a lot meatier than the Founders Edition 5090. So I think it's kind of a shame, because These are really nicely engineered graphics cards. In prior generations, I'd say the Founders Editions were like competitive with some of the better board partner cards, but in this case, I'd say that it's clearly a really nice design, probably a better design than a lot of those board partner cards. And it's a shame this probably won't be as widely available as those cards will be, obviously, because it is a Founders Edition product.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do. Does leave a bit of a sour taste in the mouth when Nvidia is kind of clowning the field like this. And, I'd love to see that card more widely distributed, or at least for board partners to get the picture. And maybe this time around, CES 2026, everyone's adopted this design, and we're seeing a ton of board partners with it. So that would at least be a nice outcome here. But those aren't the only desktop cards that have been revealed in this showcase, because we have the 5070 and 5070 Ti, which are maybe a little bit less exciting from a spec perspective than something like that chart-busting 5090 that's going to blow past any 4090 series benchmarks that we've seen so far. And they also use a more conventional cooler design, but actually these come in priced pretty competitively with some of the outgoing products, more competitively than I thought they would be, right?
Yeah, specifically, I think everyone after the show and immediately during the show when Jensen Huang was doing his presentation, they saw that slide of RTX 5070 equals RTX 4090. We'll talk about that momentarily, but for the price, the cool price of $549, the price of the 70 series line of GPUs has been going up ever since the GTX 1070. Pretty radically. Obviously, we have stuff like GTX 970 being one of the best price performance GPUs ever released. 10 series was also really good, especially as you start going up the stack. But then you get to RTX 2070, and that for the time was, for its price, expensive. Over time now we've seen it kind of proving itself versus Pascal before it, but definitely on release, it didn't seem or feel that way at all. It was actually bad in that aspect. You get to RTX 3000, it's another story of that light, but you start getting caveats to those 70 series cards, and that's kind of what we see here. The base RTX 5070 for its performance profile still has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, much like the 40 series before it. RTX 4070, RTX 4070 Super, for example. And that is, I think, like the cold water on the fire for a lot of people. We'll get to that at the end of this video more, but that is a big distinction here. The RTX 5070, using the more classical heatsink fan design for the FE version, 549, 12 gigs of VRAM. Or they say it's like RTX 4090 power, but that is talking about using multi-frame gen. For the RTX 5070 Ti, boost in specs in terms of shader T-flops, as well as all the other things. It's also going to have 16 gigs of VRAM, which I would say is good. It's putting it more in that like original RTX 4080 level. But gen on gen versus like the previous versions, it's like similar to what you described with the RTX 5080, right? This GPU. Not super large gen on gen stuff in the previous titles. The examples they gave are interesting because they constantly are using Horizon Forbidden West here, right? As well as Resident Evil 4 games that, they have some legacy components in them, and they were targeting cross-gen to a certain degree. And you also have a very low usage of things like ray tracing. Forbidden West, 0 ray tracing, and Resident Evil 4, as I described in my review,
bad ray tracing.
So, these are showing, I would say, like the raster performance gen on gen difference. For games that are using more RT, it actually could be larger, but that is not what Nvidia talked about, because whenever they showed any of those games, they would want to throw up that MFG result. Essentially, you're getting 2.9 times higher smoothness than the previous gen in such titles. Here we've got 549, 749, both of which look on their face as good prices. They're not as heavily increased as a lot of people would have rumored beforehand, but there are caveats there which make people, I would say, consider these GPUs.
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that Nvidia is basically telling us at the same settings, with the same kind of DLSS going on, with the same ray tracing, whatever, they should be 20%-ish faster. That's what they quoted to us here.
Right, they did.
But how exactly how fast those will be in practice, we'll have to test that, of course. And then, of course, the big selling point here is that you get that MFG result, and all of a sudden you are indeed looking at something that is much, much, much more powerful in practice, but the utility of frame generation and its relative merits at different internal frame rates and things like that. That's a whole different discussion we'll have at the end of this whole thing. And also I would note, like, a lot of the partner cards in this, we did see some partner cards and they are big. They're still pretty big. Most of them are still pretty big. There are some dual slots in there, but most of them are pretty substantial. So for sure you do want to be discriminatory in your picking of different cards there, and make sure you pick the right one for you, and maybe don't pick one of the 4-slot 8-pound ones perhaps.
No, please.
But moving on from desktop graphics, because I know we here at DF don't focus as much maybe on laptop graphics performance, but that is a key market. There are a lot of laptop gamers out there, and I actually think Blackwell looks pretty interesting for laptops. So what does Blackwell bring to laptop gamers, Alex?
Yeah, so there's the exact same naming and numerology to the laptop line of GPUs, with no M designation, no max Q designation like you lament, Oliver. So these are RTX 5090, 5080, 5070 Ti, RTX 5070 for laptops. And as we know, laptops are thermally and power constrained. They are going to not be like the max, they recommend 1,000 watt for an RTX 5090. One of those running in a laptop, potentially on battery, is not going to be targeting that level of power supply, right? So they mention here very specifically at the top end that it's going to be, with the RTX 5090, 1490 performance. But once again, with that large star next to it that says, oh, they're presumably meaning with multi-frame gen. So I would see here desktop level RTX 5070 kind of for the top end. And I imagine actually it might be a little bit lower due to, once again, just power and thermal considerations. And then going down the stack, it kind of goes down into, these are almost like, for me, it's in my brain what a 5070 would be like, then a 5060 Ti, then a 5060, and it's going down, right?
Right.
This naming is not very helpful for the average consumer, I would say. But there's more to it. Like we talked in our previous video, looking at that Razer laptop. It's smaller, thinner, more power efficient. The Blackwell features in regards to power gating that we talked about earlier, the new Max Q stuff, that's all going to help this design run better than the previous generation within the same power envelope. But another thing that they mentioned was an interesting use case for machine learning, and they call it battery boost, motion detection, essentially for limiting the thermals and power of the GPU. And in this case, I think they're using the example, maybe what was Baldur's Gate 3? I can't exactly recall specifically, but basically,
I think it is, yeah.
Looking at how much change is going on per frame, probably with a variety of inputs there, just like color, whatever, tracking pixels over frame. And they can then throttle up and down the GPU. And I think their target for full throttle is 60 FPS, and then half that for when it's going to start downclocking. So in a movement heavy scene, you'll be getting the GPU in its full, presumably, and then a low movement scene, like typical conversation, it would be using the lower power profile and targeting 30 FPS. Now, I'm not one to love constant changes in frame rate, but this is another option for the power discerning gamer out there who games on the go. So it's just another option. But what do you think about that, Oliver?
I think it's an interesting technology. It is maybe not the way that I would personally go. Like you said, I think that, at least to me, I'm so attuned to differences in the frame rate that it would immediately bother me pretty quickly. But I also suspect that there are some really compelling technologies here. For Blackwell and laptops, I think DLSS 4 has to be at the forefront here, in particular MFG, because you just might not need the same class of GPU to service a 1080p or 1440p or 4K display at high refresh rates in particular as you would before, as long as you're willing to accept some frame gen artifacts Again, we need to see it in person to know exactly how impactful those will be at low internal frame rates, but accept that and accept some greater input latency. And it could actually be a pretty good experience. Like, I think laptop gamers are probably more tolerant to those kinds of artifacts. And when you decrease that base frame rate internally and you rely on MFG, you're likely to get a big power savings. So that could help you out both on battery and not on battery to sustain good levels of performance in demanding titles. Especially because I think for mobile gamers, probably they're happy to be at 120 FPS, probably happy to be at 160 FPS, something like that. They'd be ecstatic for those numbers, probably. And
Right.
this is a great technology to get you there that you didn't have before. But I think in terms of the general performance of this line, they only really shared performance info on the 5080 laptop, but they did say that you should expect similar kinds of performance gains across the whole family, which is like they quoted a 10 to 30% increase in performance. So yeah, that's kind of in line with the rest of the Blackwell series. I'd expect it just because of the DLSS4-ness of it all, that actually could be a more compelling upgrade than the other GPUs in this architecture.
Right.
Because in desktop, maybe you aren't necessarily always dialing in that maximum frame gen, but on the laptop parts, I mean, it's giving you so much power savings in particular that I think it starts to become a lot more appealing potentially. So that's
Agreed.
something that I'm certainly interested in.